Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is one of those languages that can seem frozen in time until you look closely and realize it changed, traveled, split into dialects, and picked up layers as people kept reading and preserving it. The big story here is that the Hebrew of the Bible wasn't one perfectly uniform thing. It developed out of the Canaanite world, was written in different scripts, preserved through a surprisingly fragile manuscript history, and it makes sense only when you hear the grammar and sound system as living parts of a language. Biblical Hebrew belongs to the Northwest Semitic family, in the Canaanite branch, and it developed in the region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean coast. In its earliest phases, it was barely separable from Phoenician and other Canaanite languages. The sharper differences show up later, especially during the Iron Age. That alone is a useful reminder that languages don't arrive with neat labels attached. Early on, Hebrew was part of a broader local language continuum. Even the Bible usually doesn't call the language Hebrew. It uses phrases like the language of Canaan or Judean. The label Hebrew became standard later in Koine Greek and in Mishnaic Hebrew, and the deeper origin of the name is still debated. As a spoken first language, Hebrew lasted through the Second Temple period. By the Roman era, it gradually stopped being everyday vernacular speech around the 2nd century CE, though it continued as literary and liturgical Hebrew and later became the basis for the modern revival in the 19th century. The earliest Hebrew writing used Paleo-Hebrew, a script related to Phoenician, and ultimately descended from older Proto-Canaanite writing. Some of the key early finds are the Khirbet Kiyafa Ostracon from the 10th century BCE, plus the Gezer calendar and the Siloam inscription. After the Babylonian captivity, Jews gradually shifted to the imperial Aramaic alphabet, and that became the ancestor of the square Hebrew script people recognize today. Meanwhile, the Samaritans kept a descendant of the older script, which survives as the Samaritan alphabet. So the older writing tradition never fully vanished. It just took a different road. Early Hebrew writing mostly recorded consonants. Over time, letters like Aleph, He, Vav, and Yod were used more and more as vowel markers, and the full system of vowel signs and cantillation marks was added much later by the Masoretes, especially in the Tiberian tradition around the 9th century CE. This is one of the most important things to keep in view. The surviving biblical Hebrew text is not a direct audio recording from the biblical period spelled out on paper. What we have is an ancient consonantal text that was transmitted across generations, and then medieval scholars added vocalization and chanting signs that preserve later reading traditions. So the Masoretic text is ancient and medieval at the same time. It carries a very old textual backbone, but the pronunciation system attached to it reflects a later stage of tradition. There's no complete Hebrew Bible manuscript from before 400 BCE. One very early witness is the Ketef Hinnom silver scrolls, which preserve a form of the priestly blessing from the 7th or 6th century BCE. It's actually pretty remarkable that so much survived at all, because the climate of ancient Israel was much harder on papyrus and parchment than the dry conditions that helped preserve texts in places like Egypt. To reconstruct older spelling and pronunciation, scholars compared the Masoretic tradition with the Dead Sea Scrolls, Samaritan manuscripts, and Greek and Latin transcriptions. Those sources don't line up in one perfectly tidy line, and that matters. Their differences show that the biblical text moved through regional and historical variation rather than one single unchanged reading tradition. Biblical Hebrew had real regional variation, especially between northern Israeli Hebrew and southern Judean Hebrew. A nice example comes from the Samaria Ostraka, where a diphthong that had been something like age seems to simplify to a long E sound. So a northern form for wine appears as yain, while southern Hebrew preserves the form reflected as yain. And then there's the famous shibboleth story in Judges, where Ephraimites are said to pronounce it Sibboleth instead of Shibboleth. It's memorable for obvious reasons, but linguistically it's valuable because it shows pronunciation could mark group identity. Later varieties kept changing too. Late Biblical Hebrew and Qumran Hebrew show stronger Aramaic influence, while Samaritan Hebrew developed on its own after Jewish and Samaritan traditions split. Some dialects also weakened or merged guttural sounds, which is another reminder that there was never one single perfectly uniform biblical Hebrew pronunciation, however tempting that sounds in a textbook. The consonant system included emphatic, pharyngeal, and glottal sounds, and for some of them the exact ancient pronunciation is still uncertain. Letters like chanda originally represented distinctions that were probably stronger than in many later traditions, likely involving uvular and pharyngeal articulation. Some Greek transcriptions seem to preserve clues to that older contrast. Biblical Hebrew also went through major historical sound changes. One famous one is the Canaanite shift, where an older long moved toward O. There were also mergers among older sibilant sounds, the loss of final unstressed vowels, and the flattening of diphthongs into single vowels. That's part of why the same word can look surprisingly different across sources from different periods. Another important development is the begad-ki-fat pattern, where letters like bet, gimel, dalet, kaf, p, and tav could alternate between stop and fricative pronunciations, depending on position. The familiar dot-based distinction in later manuscripts reflects that historical alternation, and it seems to have developed after the earliest consonantal writing, with Aramaic influence playing a role. Like other Semitic languages, Biblical Hebrew relies heavily on a root and pattern system. You start with a set of consonants, usually a root, and fit them into different vocalic and consonantal patterns to produce related words. That non-concatenative structure is especially productive in verbs, and it's one of the features that gives the language its distinct feel. Nouns and adjectives mark masculine and feminine, singular and plural, and they also have a limited dual form. The dual is worth pausing on because it gets misunderstood. It isn't just the regular form for exactly two things. It's a specialized category used especially for natural pairs and certain measurements. Possession is often expressed through the construct state, where the possessed noun appears in a reduced form before the possessor. And pronominal suffixes can attach directly to nouns and verbs to show possession or objects. Hebrew is very good at packing a lot of grammatical information into one word, which is elegant when you know what you're looking at, and mildly humbling when you don't. The verbal system is one of the places where people expect a simple tense chart and don't really get one. Biblical Hebrew is often described as preferring verb-subject-object order, unlike modern Hebrew, though some of that impression may come from how common narrative wake-tol clauses are. Other kinds of clauses may lean more often toward subject-verb-object than the old shorthand suggests. The two major conjugation sets are traditionally called perfect and imperfect, but those labels can be misleading if you read them as simple past and present. A given form can express completed action, ongoing action, habitual action, command, condition, or future expectation depending on context, discourse flow, and constructions with VAV. That includes the so-called wall consecutive pattern, where linking with word can shift how a verb functions in narrative sequence. So with Biblical Hebrew, meaning doesn't sit neatly inside the verb form all by itself. You often have to read the clause in motion, with the sentences around it doing a lot of the work. Taken together, Biblical Hebrew looks less like a museum piece and more like a long-lived language with a deep memory, a lot of regional texture, and a very complicated filing system. And honestly, once you see the layers, the script changes, and the dialects, the language feels more human. Ancient, yes, but very much used by actual people with actual accents. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.